11 March 2007 will mark the 100th anniversary of my mother's birth. When she died on the 27th of May 1991, I was stunned, but I did not grieve as much as I would have expected. Maybe this was because I was caught up in the immediate tasks of arranging her funeral and starting to sort out her possessions. But since then, there have been many times that I have felt deep grief and a tremendous sense of loss. Sometimes this just happens. At other times it is triggered by something that reminds me of her. The death of a friend once caused me to grieve more for my mother than I did for my friend, and I often feel the need to talk to her, especially when I think of or want to know more about facts, jokes, and words to songs that only she would have known, and especially when I visit Paris, and of course Berlin, the two cities that figured so prominently in her life. I hope that this tribute will also bring back memories for you who knew her. My mother was born in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire 100 years ago into a middle-class, German-speaking Jewish family. Her mother came from a large and well-to-do family of a successful brewer, and her father was a lawyer who later on helped out his wife's siblings and in-laws when that generation began to dissipate the brewer's business and fortune. My mother once offended other family members when she compared the Strassmann clan to the Buddenbrooks, the grand family whose decline is described in Thomas Mann's novel. My mother was named Hannah, but was always called Hansi. She was Austrian at birth, but in 1918 she woke up one morning to discover that, thanks to the reorganization of Europe after World War I, she had become Czechoslovakian overnight. Hansi had two older siblings. Here they are with their nanny. Clara was also my mother's nanny, and they loved each other very much. One day, when Hansi's parents felt she no longer needed a nanny, Clara was sent away. This is the only picture we have of her and her wonderful hat. Valerie, my Tante Vali, was a middle-class lady who married a middle-class lawyer. This is a photo of them on their honeymoon in Venice. Richard Koch had served with distinction as an officer in the Austrian army in World War I. Shortly after the Anschluss, the German takeover of Austria, a bunch of Nazi thugs bashed on Vali and Richard's door in Vienna, demanding to see the Jew Koch. Richard appeared in full military uniform, glaring down at them. They scuttled away, but Vali and Richard knew it was time to leave Austria. Hansi's brother was my uncle Gerhard. Gerhard was an ardent Zionist when he was young, and he became an ardent communist after serving in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. The Communist Party ordered Gerhard to remain in Czechoslovakia after the Germans occupied that country in 1938-39. In 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, the Gauleiter of Czechoslovakia, was assassinated, and Gerhard was amongst the many executed by the Nazis in the wake of the assassination. Hansi went to school in Austria-Czechoslovakia, but did not go on to further studies due to health problems. Instead, she studied music, first at home, and then in a German school of music in Prague, where she graduated as a music teacher. Hansi's family could afford regular holidays, such as this one in 1921, and her parents gave her moral and financial support when she wanted to travel to and live in other European cities that she felt would meet her artistic interests. From 1930 to 1933, Hansi lived in Berlin. She joined the community of artists and left-wing performers in the cabaret and literary movements described in Christopher Isherwood's accounts of those times. And no, that isn't Hansi sitting on the barrel. When Hitler came to power, she moved to Paris, where she became involved with the group of émigré artists and performers who were artistically and politically active. She studied French and German literature at the Sorbonne, but I don't know whether she obtained a formal qualification. She had a couple of books of poetry published about this time, Chimären and Ragout. When the Germans invaded France, she intended to stay and fight for Paris, an idealistic but also very dangerous position for a Jewish communist sympathiser to adopt. Her ex-lover, Lucien Goldman, who was still a good friend, convinced her to flee with him. This is a picture of him in later life when he was a highly regarded professor of philosophy at the Sorbonne. Years later, in Australia, a young friend who was a rising academic at a local university asked my mother if she had heard of the philosopher Lucien Goldman during her time in Paris. Actually, he was my lover for 3 years, my mother told her astonished friend. Lucien and Hansi had many adventures getting to so-called Free France. She recalled this flight in a letter published in a local Australian newspaper 40 years later. She described how she and her grandson, my son Adam, had to leave his mother's home very quickly when the whole area was threatened by terrible bushfires. In hitting the road to flee the fires, with Adam taking only those possessions they could carry, notably his pet budgerigar, my mother saw many similarities with her flight from the Nazis in 1940. After Lucien and my mother went their separate ways, she met Richard Löw, an engineer who wrote plays and poetry under the nom de plume of Georg Wolf. They became lovers and even went through a quasi-religious marriage ceremony, which apparently carried no legal weight. Richard was a charming Viennese with a great sense of humour. However, possibly due to the difficult times, but more probably because of his natural inclinations, he was involved in various swindles that exploited the serious problems that people, especially Jews, wanting to flee from Europe, had at that time. As things got tougher in all of France, Hansi and Richard fled across the border to Switzerland in 1941 or 1942. There they remained in hiding with a relative of Hansi's father until Richard so annoyed him with one of his fraudulent schemes that he denounced them both to the Swiss authorities. They were placed in a refugee camp. During her time there, my mother took part in and organised various reviews and entertainments. Richard eventually extricated himself from the camp and abandoned my mother, taking up with a young Swiss woman, but not before I was conceived in August of 1942. My mother at this time had been seriously contemplating suicide. She had learnt of the death of her father and the deportation of her mother. The de facto husband had a new relationship, not his last as it happens. When she learned she was pregnant, she was determined to survive. As the war turned against the Germans, the Swiss became friendlier towards their refugees, and many, including my mother and me, were moved out of camps and into billeted accommodation. During her time in Switzerland, Hansi wrote Jacqueline's Traumland, Jacqueline's Dreamland, a collection of stories for children. Die vertauschten Tiere. Jacqueline erzählt ihrer Puppen eine Geschichte, sodass sie besser schlafen können. Die Heldin heißt auch Jacqueline. Eines Abends ging sie in den Wald und beobachtete die Tiere, als sie zu Bett gingen. Das Kamel legte seinen Buckel und der Elefanten seinen Rüssel ab. Der Löwe nahm seine Mähne, wie ein Kahlköpfiger die Perücke, hinunter. Die Giraffe zog sich die Spirale aus dem Hals, um den Kopf auf die Schulter oder auf das Kissen legen zu können. Frau Tiger und Frau Zebra bügelten ihren Männern noch rasch die schwarzen Streifen aus und hingen sie über einen Stuhl. Dann schliefen die Tiere ein und schnarchten friedlich. Da stieg Jacqueline vom Baum und vertauschte alles. The Mixed Up Animals. Jacqueline tells her dolls bedtime stories to help them go to sleep. The heroine is also called Jacqueline. One day she goes into the forest where all the animals live and watches them go to sleep. The camel removed his hump and the elephant his trunk. The lion took off his mane just like a bald man takes off his wig. The giraffe pulled the spring out of his neck so that he could put his head onto his shoulder or onto his pillow. Mrs. Tiger and Mrs. Zebra hurriedly ironed their husbands' black stripes and hung them over a chair. Then the animals fell asleep and snored peacefully. Seeing this, Jacqueline climbed down from the tree and changed everything about. When the war ended, my mother had to decide where she would go. She didn't want to, and in any case probably couldn't, return to Czechoslovakia, as it would only accept Czech or Slovak speakers. Her personal preference would have been Paris, but there were various difficulties associated with this, amongst which were the needs of a young child and the strict entry requirements of the French. In 1939, Tante Valley had gone with her husband to Australia. They were ready to sponsor us as immigrants. Australia at the time was engaged in extremely energetic schemes to populate the country with Europeans. So we arrived in Australia in November 1947 as Hannah and Guido Hermann Fuchs. In Australia, my mother found that Fuchs was generally mispronounced with embarrassing results and sought permission to change our family name to FOX. However, there was a regulation or policy at the time, this was about 1949, that non-Australians could not use English spellings if they changed their names, although they could do so once they became Australian citizens. So, permission was given to change our name to FOKS, a name that could be pronounced Fox, but spelled differently. We became Australian citizens in 1953. We had been stateless till then. But we decided to keep the FOKS spelling. My name also caused problems. Guido is a tribute to one of my mother's favourite authors, Guy de Maupassant, although why she chose the Italian version of the name was never made clear to me. And Hermann was her father's name. As Australians had difficulty pronouncing Guido, I was asked to choose one that they could handle more easily. The English version of Guido is Guy. This would have made me Guy Fawkes, so this was not considered to be an option. My hero at the time was Jack of Jack and the Beanstalk, and so I became Jack Fox. My mother and many of our European friends continued to call me Guido. Living in Australia was not easy for my mother. There were the obvious hardships of being a single mother and not being qualified or experienced in work that would produce a regular income. But in addition, she found herself in a country that at the time had a dramatically different attitude towards the arts than she did, whose dedication to sport was beyond her comprehension. One of the first headlines she saw was, "England defeated," causing her to think that war had, unbeknownst to her, broken out yet again. And radio programs in the boarding houses in which we lived for the first 9 years of our time in Melbourne seemed to consist of very little else than excited descriptions of horses racing against each other. She also found that Australians viewed foreigners and their languages with deep suspicion. She wrote several poems about this. One of them is called "How Do You Like Australia?", a question that she and all other visitors to Australia found themselves being asked. She ends the poem with the question, "Australia, how do you like me?" Another poem tells how she moved from being a BF, bloody foreigner, to an IM, interesting migrant. She found work where she could and worked as a cleaning lady in the local synagogue, did piecework embroidery and, increasingly, taught languages and music at home and languages in various private schools. Here she is with the girls from one of her classes at Mentone Girls Grammar School. She had various office jobs, and for a considerable time she worked as a punch powers operator on machines that were mechanical forerunners of computerized databases. She continued to write poems, essays and children's stories, but was not published except for inclusions in anthologies of multicultural writers' works. Several of her works were translated into English, and one of these was a collection of children's stories called In and Out of the Sanctuary, which was an Australian sequel to Jacqueline's Traumland, and for which a now well-known artist, Mirka Moira, prepared the illustrations. The first story is an Australian version of The Mixed Up Animals. "Enough of cowboys and other games," cried Jack to his playmates. "I would rather tell you a story, a true one, of how I mixed up the animals in the sanctuary." Well, one evening I decided to stay in the sanctuary after it was closed and to wait for the animals to go to sleep. As I had suspected, they didn't take all their bits and pieces to bed with them. Before going to sleep, the koala bear took off his false leather nose. The lyrebird, of course, put aside his lyre so that the strings wouldn't break. Mother kangaroo unlaced her pouch and took the springs out of her hind legs. The emu pulled the long stick out of his neck. Mind you, it's no ordinary stick, oh no, but made of the finest ivory. The wombat removed his fur coat, the lizard hung their tails on numbered pegs. The platypus was locked up somewhere, but I would have left it alone anyway, it's mixed up enough as it is. However, I did have a lot of fun with the spare parts of the other animals. Once they were fast asleep, I changed over everything. The kangaroo was given the lyre, the koala the kangaroo pouch, the lyrebird the emu's ivory stick, the wombat the kangaroo's springs, and the emu received the wombat's fur coat. The koala's nose I put on myself. In those days there was still enough room for my own nose behind it. Unfortunately, the publication of this collection was abandoned when the intending publisher went broke. Towards the end of her time in formal employment, Hansi received financial aid from two sources. The local Jewish welfare had assisted her from time to time in the past, and, when she turned 60, provided her with a small retirement apartment at a nominal rental, and she received restitution and a pension from the German government for income foregone due to the policies of the Nazis. So she remained actively engaged in her writing and in activities associated with it, such as membership of the Multicultural Women Writers Association and the Alliance Française, although she could never bring herself to get in touch with the Goethe Society. The memories of the betrayals by German speakers went too deep for that. And she also remained politically active, marching in the moratoriums against the Vietnam War and demonstrating for the rights of the Australian Aborigines. Hansi was a passionate woman. She cared deeply about her art, and she cared deeply about humanitarian causes. In Jacqueline's Traumland, she wrote the following dedication in 1946. "I dedicate this book to my son Guido. I wrote it for him and all the little ones who can be children again with their children's joys and children's problems. Children who can now make peaceful discoveries and when they see an aeroplane can think of beautiful journeys and not bombed cities anymore. Children for whom cellars are places for jolly games of hide and seek and not bomb shelters. Children who can once again laugh without regret and, I hope, will do so with and because of Jacqueline, the heroine of my stories. She loved her son and was passionate about her grandchildren, Joanna and Adam. When she appeared on a television quiz show in 1969, the compere asked her what her occupation was. She replied, "Expectant grandmother." You will not be surprised to hear that her special subject on the quiz was music. She answered every question that was put to her, then suddenly asked the compere how much she had won till then. $200, he replied. "Good, that's exactly what I need for my new piano," she announced, and marched off the set, leaving the usually unflappable compere at a total loss for words. My mother died on the 27th of May 1991. She had been in very good health until the late 1980s, and even then her only problem was a faulty heart valve that caused her to pass out now and then, an inconvenience she was prepared to put up with rather than subject herself to the surgeon's knife. I'm not sure how Hansi would react to the thought of turning 100. I know that she would have been delighted to be around when her beloved granddaughter Joanna performed on the stage, as she did in this production of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Coat that toured all around Australia. And regardless of age, she would have wanted to go to Joanna's Pilates classes. And she would have been ecstatic when Joanna, with a little help from her husband Anthony, produced two beautiful great-grandsons, Aidan and Geordie. And she would have been so pleased and proud that her wonderful grandson, Adam, with the strong support of his wife Andrea, was successfully continuing the family tradition of writing stories for children. She herself would have continued writing, probably on her old Hermes typewriter, and no doubt with as many typos as ever. She would not have been happy with the state of the world and would have protested, person or in spirit, depending on her physical strength, against several of the policies and practices of her adopted country and of its allies. She and I would talk about family history, sing the old songs, tell each other the old jokes, and share our delight in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I would tell her, despite some of the difficult times between us, and there were one or two, just how much she meant to me in the 48 years I knew her, just how much I owe her, and just how much I miss her.